Hello, America. This is Mark Dunagan, your host, and you have landed at the Daily Answer. You've got enough questions in life. You need some answers. Today, we're going to do a scripture hike. We are going to start about halfway through Genesis chapter 4. And in a previous episode on destroying the ideal, which is a concept I got from a podcast I'd listened on Jordan Peterson, and I thought it was a great point on the interaction between Cain and Abel, and thought I'd add more of a Christian perspective when it came to that. And so we want to start in Genesis chapter 4, verse 11. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And so here are the consequences of Cain's action. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden. I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So the Lord said to him, therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain, so that no one finding him would slay him. Well, let's talk about some things that really strike my mind as I go through this section. You might say, well, why doesn't God just take Cain's life? That would have been fair, right? He took Abel's life. Well, God is not wishing for any to perish. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. And so keeping Cain alive gives Cain the opportunity to repent and make his life right with God. Ultimately, that's what God is primarily interested in, people being saved, people correcting themselves. But number two, being a wanderer on the earth and being a former farmer, and now the ground will not yield its fruit. Now the ground fights against you. That almost might be a worse punishment than dying, because it sounds like a life of restlessness and a life of on the move and a life of never arriving and a life of the thing that you did for a living, you can't do that anymore. The thing that you might have been very, very good at, he may have been an incredibly good farmer. Sorry, that's off the table. When Adam is, and Eve as well, when they are punished for their sin, they do not complain. I don't find any complaint once the verdict comes down. Neither one of them say, my punishment is greater than I can bear. It's interesting that unlike Adam and Eve, who issue no protest, Cain presents before the Lord his grievance. Which I think tells us that the thing that got Cain in trouble in the first place is that Cain listened to himself. Cain was in love with his own voice. Cain did not submit to God. Cain would not bring his thinking in line with God's truth. And Cain's obviously not at the point of godly sorrow. My punishment's too greater than I can bear. Hey, you need to be grateful you're still alive, dude. I mean, hello, wake up. It was certainly easier than Abel's death. Have you thought about that? Anytime people complain about God's harshness or the consequences, we already know something. They have not repented. They have not come to terms with the damage that they have caused. And so Cain remains unrepentant, and he's grumbling as well. He talks about driven from the face of the ground. I think that his life as a farmer and getting his livelihood from the ground. From your face, I will be hidden. Well, wait a minute, Cain, you made that choice. It's not that God moved. It's you moved, and then God adjusted his position. You're the one who moved. You're the one who walked away from God. And God already told you previously that could be corrected. If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? You have made the perpetual choice to move away from God. Well, God doesn't hear my prayers. Okay, well, who's responsible for that? Who made that choice? Whoever finds me will kill me. Obviously, there are a number of people on the earth right now, and I think one writer made an excellent observation that we really don't know at what point, I think, in the lifetime of Cain that this happens, how old he is, how far we are from creation. But one writer noted that even using conservative population statistics from just an original couple, 800 years after the beginning, we could easily have 120,000 people on the face of the earth. And whoever finds me will kill me. That is, there's a lot of kin to Abel out there. That there are a number of relatives to Abel out there. And so the fear is that they're going to come after him. And it's interesting that almost Cain feels like that's a reasonable thing that could happen. So the Lord, it says, appointed a sign for Cain. Some translations have a mark, but there's really nothing in the text that says the mark was actually on Cain himself. I think that may have been a mistake that a number of commentators have jumped to. It may have been no sort of physical thing on Cain at all. It may have been simply a sign that God at that time showed Cain to reassure him that no one's going to take his life. And it could be also, you're not going to get off that easy. You're going to have a life of wandering, and hopefully in the process, you're going to change your ways. Your life is not going to be easy. You're just not going to be put out of your misery. You're going to have to live with this. You're going to have to live with this for a long, long time. And then it says, Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. I think that's interesting. Is that it almost seems that this is the final break. Cain and God will have no more conversations. I mean, at this point, Cain could have said something like, "Is there any hope for me? Would you forgive me? What do I do to get back on the right track?" God is always willing to welcome back the repentant sinner. Even David, who commits adultery and murder, David is welcomed back when David repents. The prodigal son, who completely squandered the estate given to him, is welcomed back when he comes back and says, Cain would say, I murdered Abel, I murdered my brother, there is no excuse for that, and I've sinned against you, and against thee only have I sinned. And yet, there seems to be none of that here. There are many opportunities. Cain has many opportunities to correct his path. But this seems like kind of the final break. He simply goes out from the presence of the Lord. And tell you what, that is a scary thought. Well, as we walk down through the text, the next question that the thing that caught my attention was it says, Cain had relations with his wife. Now, at what point, we don't know at what point he has that wife. He may already have her when all of this goes down. He may already have a wife when he murders Abel. We're just not told. And I know a lot of people are like, well, where did he get his wife? Well, Genesis 5 verse 4 tell us clearly that Adam and Eve had many other children that are not named in the Genesis record. And so and we're not told exactly when Cain murders Abel and when the wife is picked up, but we may be hundreds of years into the story. And at that point, Cain may have all sorts of options to choose from, because Lamech, one of his descendants, not only does not have a problem finding a wife, he finds two. Obviously, this would have been some sort of a distant relative or a relative. And that should not surprise us, because Abraham marries a half-sister. All right? So this is early on in human history. And she conceived and bare birth to Enoch, and he built a city. Now, it's interesting there. A person might say, well, then does Cain get around? Does Cain get around the divine consequences that come down upon him? I mean, God says you're going to be a wanderer and a vagabond, and yet this text says he built a city. Actually, I think the grammar is he was building a city. That is, he may have never finished building the city, that he started it, but it doesn't necessarily mean he finished it. The other thing is, it doesn't necessarily mean he stayed there. And so I, I believe what God said. You're going to be a wanderer. And as much as man may try, and I think some commentators may have a good observation here, is that instead of relying upon the promise from God, no one's going to take your life, building the city may have been Cain's attempt at security. I will build me a fort. No one can get me there. I will create some sort of city for myself and some sort of security for myself because I don't trust God's guarantee. And man, is that a problem of man? Of God has the answer, but I'm not gonna trust God's solution. Just one more mistake that unrepentant sinners make is they try to solve their own self-caused problems without God's existence. They look for loopholes in God's law. They try to get around avoiding God's law. They try to circumvent the consequences of their actions. But I still believe that what the text says, in spite of the fact that he starts building a city, he still remains a wanderer. I mean, you can be in a marriage and still incredibly alone. You can have built yourself a fort and still be a wanderer and restless in that fort. And you can build a city and then move on like, well, this is too close to those people, so I'm going to move on and do another one and do another one and do another one. You know, people like that. They try to find a peace that only God can provide, and they try to find it in human solutions. And you might say, what we're looking at here from 17 down through 24, what we're looking at here is the beginning of what you might call the world that God tells us not to love. This is the only record we have of early man. And I'm just impressed in what is said about Cain's descendants. In verse 20, the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. And so we have early on in human history, we have domesticated animals. And then Jubal, the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. We have leisure time. We have the beginning of the arts and culture and music. And even Lamech's going to give a little bit of poetry, if you might call it that. But obviously, early man is not spending every waking hour digging under rocks for grubs and roots and berries or whatever. Early man is advanced. And then, verse 22, we have a descendant of Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron. We're working with metals. You have you have urbanization, you have animal domestication, you have agriculture, as you're seeing Cain and Abel, you have the working of metals and making implements, and you have all of that in a generation or so right after Adam and Eve. And so early man doesn't go through thousands of millions of years of trying to figure out how to build a fire or raising animals and all of that. All of the stuff of civilization is right there. And Cain's descendants are not godly, but ungodly people have gifts and talents. And what I find here is when you look at Lamech's speech to his wives, in verse 23, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech, for I have, or I will, kill a man for wounding me, a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77fold. And that is a microcosm of the world. And what I mean by that is you look out in the world and there's amazing technology on display, okay? And here is man that it looks like he can handle in its environment. The only trouble is he can't handle himself. He can't handle himself. Here's a world that can put a man on the moon and make electric cars and cell phones and cannot make a family and a marriage work. I mean, people that can come up with amazing, sophisticated satellites and telescopes, and yet they can't handle their money, and they can't handle their thoughts, and they can't handle their anger. No wonder the book of Proverbs says that the person who rules their spirit is mightier than the person that can rule a city. Keeping your head on straight, that takes a lot more effort and wisdom than winning a battle. And what's going on in verse 23 and 24, I think, is that Lamech looks at the potential in these implements of bronze and iron, realize the destructive potential, and almost like lifts up a sword that's been made and say, well, if God can avenge sevenfold, me, myself, and I with this weapon, well, we can do a lot more. And talk about arrogance. And it's almost like, I don't need God in my life. I've got this weapon. And this will enable me to take my own revenge. And there's the world. Good job, Cain. You walked away from the presence of the Lord and you brought a curse upon all your descendants. And as far as I can see, none of the descendants makes it out of that curse. It just entraps them for the rest of their lives. But Adam had relations with his wife again, and they named him Seth. And then it says, then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. There's hope. Today, I hope that their future Seths were born. That is, young men and young women today were born that are going to be like Joshua, who will say, as far as me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Even when the world is really dark, there are Seths that are being born. And even when the world is really dark, there are still men calling upon the name of the Lord. This is Mark Dunagan for the Daily Answer. Until next time, we'll see you in the funny papers. Thank you for listening to the Daily Answer. And something else that I really enjoy is that on Wednesdays at noon Eastern Time, there is a live Bible Q&A on answering religious error. And there's a panel of great men that answer live Bible questions. And I'm just impressed that they're willing to tackle anything. Any question that you have, they are not going to shy away from. So check that out. Live Bible Q&A, answering religious error on Wednesdays at 12 or noon Eastern Time.